about what we're doing, and then we can go from there.
Hi. Well, I guess a little bit of history is since we started this project, what, 8 months ago, we didn't know that mud existed, and then throughout the life cycle of this project, mud became more and more prevalent in the discussion. And then until today, we've been trying to set up a meeting with Eliot to discuss our project, our status update, and where we're at with respect to mud development. So at the high level, CIRA, we're building a secure home gateway project initiative we have, and I can share on the chat the link on GitHub for the project PowerPoint that describes the project. But basically, for CIRA, the main reason CIRA is working on a secure home gateway is to mitigate the possible DDoS attacks from IoT device, like the Mirai style attacks. So having a better home gateway security framework would potentially mitigate this risk, and that's why we're working on this project.
Thanks very much for that intro, Job. I had actually gone through the video, and I've talked to Michael Richardson a little bit about the project. So I know a little bit about how you guys are moving on. And so when you and Tom asked me to do the Ask Me Anything, I agreed under one condition, which is it's great. It's fair to ask me anything as long as it's fair for me to be able to answer I don't know for some things. Okay?
Sounds
good.
Yeah, that sounds good to everyone, I'm sure.
Okay, so maybe we could start in any couple of ways here. I didn't prepare specific slides because it really is Ask Me Anything. So maybe we just start with that. But if people need an introduction, I can give a brief introduction to mud. But it looks like at least a number of people know pretty well about it. How would you like to proceed?
Let's do your mud presentation, and that'll be a good way to start, I think.
Okay, give me just a moment then. This one here. Let's just see. I might have something even nicer for you guys. With this one here. Now, my only issue is I have to make sure I can do the proper thing for sharing. Invite, share screen. There we go. And we'll share PowerPoint. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll blast through some of the initial slides, except for I want to stop here at this one for just a moment. You know, everybody has seen these ridiculous numbers. In term, you know, and in fact, I think there are more slides on how many IoT devices there are than there are IoT devices, because everybody seems to have their own estimates. I won't claim that ours are any better than anybody else's. We put up a few numbers, but what we have been seeing from a Cisco perspective is that this need that you see around 2020, it didn't used to be a 2020. It used to be a little bit earlier, and we think it's actually a little bit later. We think it's right shifting. And the reason we think it's right shifting is that enterprises are beginning to retard their acceptance of IoT devices because they've begun to understand that, you know, something like this can happen. Right? This is not new. Right? This is from this in 2016, right? But that sunk in. That really hit them. And when that didn't hit them, right? This is the Mirai attack. And if you were at the Internet Engineering Task Force meeting a couple of years ago, you saw a great presentation from a fellow Canadian and now president of ISOC, Andrew Sullivan, who talked about the anatomy of the attack. But the key thing there is that there were a lot of junky devices that really helped bring down Twitter. And if that wasn't enough, when I started all this, I was talking to the building infrastructure people. That's where I got my start. And they were all telling me, we have security, we have, we have passwords. That's good enough, right? So part of the problem we have is that, in the industries we have, we've been through this learning curve, in the computing industry. Now everybody in all the other verticals need to go through it as well. All right, let me proceed along then. MUD attempts to address this problem, right? It's not so much the sheer numbers of things. It's that we develop a cognitive deficit, actually, when we start to talk about the number of types of things. And the reason is that, we know how to do 0, 1, many when it's all the same thing. But that's a classic computer science saying, right? 0, 1, many. I'm going to have, how many peanut butter and jelly sandwiches am I going to have for lunch? Many. But when it comes to the different types of things, we have to relearn each time. And that's where our scaling breaks down. And, when I was a kid, my parents said, you want to be rich, become a doctor. More so in the United States than in Canada, but you could imagine. And these days, it's become a network administrator, right? Because there aren't going to be enough of them on the planet, given the number of types of things that are proliferating. And when I started in this business, as a joke, somebody put a toaster on the network. Well, here's a toaster on the network, right? And this is found by Shodan.io, which is the perfect demo website of the Internet of Threats, as I like to call it. So, I don't want to overstate the threats, without also thinking, these things actually do perform, great services to us. I had a great discussion this morning with with yet another IoT provider who was looking at ways, for instance, to identify unused real estate in the Bay Area. That's going to make them a lot of money. Okay, so how does MUD work? Why is it that what is it about MUD that that makes it scale? So we have a few assumptions and a few assertions to go through. And the assumption is we have a thing that has a single or small number of uses. So I'm not trying to solve the general purpose computing problem. We have, we're going to operate under the assumption that things are generally tightly constrained, right? Maybe, and the way that you guys have done this, right, I saw that you were using QR codes. That even brings the point home more. And that even things that protect themselves today, they may have zero-day vulnerabilities that nobody knows about, or you may introduce a vulnerability like Apple did with the double carriage return bug, and I think Apple's the best in the industry when it comes to security. So anybody can blow it, right? Anybody could have a 0-day. This is the basis of this work is that that's the case. And thus far, I've been proven right. And anybody who thinks I'm wrong, I'm just going to say you're wrong because, and stop there because I think we all know better. Finally, network administrators are the ultimate arbiters of how the network should be used. So anything that MUD might suggest, the network administrator might choose to do differently. So because the thing has a single or small number of uses, right, what we can say is all other uses must be unintended. I want you to know that I went to college to develop that sort of logical mind. Any intended use can be clearly identified. And by the way, when we say use, we translate that roughly into a communication pattern too. That implication doesn't always hold, but I think it holds well enough. A mechanism is needed to protect devices that may have vulnerabilities, because you have to assume they all do. And the reason that we like manufacturers to be involved is because they're the guys who built all this, right? They know what a device that has a single or small number of uses is intended to do. So it's very similar to a like a label on a, on a bottle of aspirin that tells you how to use the aspirin, but if you want to do something different, on your own head, be it. So are we talking about is this 2018 technology that we're starting with? No, we're starting with stuff that was around since when I was a student, right? We're basing this on access lists. This is, plain old access lists. And I know you guys get this because you've essentially you're building this out. So what's the flow? We're going to assume that we're going to get a MUD URL. We might get it via DHCP, LLDP, 802.1x, or as you guys did, using a QR code, which I thought was a very good idea. That's going to somehow wend its way to what we call a MUD manager. In Cisco parlance, this would be our identity services engine, or later on our DNAC framework. But you could look. It can be any number of things. It can be standalone, and in the consumer space, it's likely to be either the CPE itself, or it could even be something upstream from the CPE that controls the CPE. You look at this picture; it's very enterprise focused, for instance. So the MUD manager, receives this URL. It's going to do what it's going to do, right? It's a URL. It resolves it. Okay, now it's going to pull down a file. What we've done is we've abstracted out the IP addresses because every deployment is different. In fact, in the consumer space, I'm going to venture to say this is a little less the case than the enterprise. But even so, you still want to be precise. So you fill in the local deployment information, right? And now you have yourself some access lists. We have a couple of abstractions. Things like domain name, like a cloud-based service, you want to have a cloud endpoint, you name it a domain name, and that's your access control list, right? My controller, maybe you want to talk to a specific on-prem device, or maybe I want to talk to things on-prem that are either of the same manufacturer or of a specified manufacturer. But maybe I just do or do not want to talk to the local devices. And so these are the sort of abstractions that we had in mind. Now we take that JSON file, we fill out the abstractions, we push it down. Oh, we stop for a second and say, is this what I want on my network, right? And we ask the enterprise administrator, and I would say, as you're thinking about your secure CPE, think about how you might do that in a meaningful way, right? Because in a consumer space, asking a question that the consumer can't understand is worse than not asking at all. Okay, and then the devices get segmented. And so this is what we call microsegmentation. And we have a security model that builds out and makes us even stronger if you're using certificate-based approaches. Certificate-based approaches in the consumer environment are a little bit challenging right now because we don't have a lot of certificate-based communication. It's not like people implement EAP TLS at home. In fact, it's not like they implement EAP at home. So you have to think in different terms in the home. And the nice thing about MUD is, you could use an EAP/radius-based model in the enterprise, and you can use an SDN-based model in the home. You pick your favorite approach and run with it. And then at the end of the day, the idea is to just do the microsegmentation. So these are the the basis. I'm going to stop there and just pause because I think you guys have the feel of all this, and I hope this is just good review.
All right. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
You have any question?
Otherwise, it's a short meeting.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just jump in with it. In an enterprise setting, a lot of the assumptions MUD makes seem good. So the manufacturer provides the MUD file, but it's an enterprise. If the enterprise administrator wants to make some changes, you're buying the same lighting, you're customizing that file for the 1,000 different lights that you have in your building. Things like I can see where a lot of things work out nicely. I guess I have some more concerns about the consumer model, where you don't have the administrator taking care of everything. You don't have so you buy a device. The end user isn't going to decide to fiddle with the MUD file. It's not, to customize it to their setting. The manufacturer will provide something. It may or may not be exactly what you want. As you say, there's no EAP. It's very difficult just out of the box to even implement access controls within a home. It can be a challenge when everybody's sharing the Wi-Fi password and that's your access control. So I'm just wondering if you had thoughts about, either MUD in the home or, the evolution of it or something else in the home. Like, how do you see, I can sort of see the enterprise and it all looks good. And then I look at the home and that's what we're playing with here. We're still, I think, kind of scratching our head as we implement.
Okay, so first, Jordan, thanks for the question, and I did watch your video in which you were talking about this, and I appreciate the questions. Believe it or not, I started out thinking about the home in all of this. It wasn't, even though Cisco is an enterprise, company, we focus on enterprise. Eliot has a network connection at home, and wants to have a bunch of devices at home, and is just concerned about what's going to happen. So the real question you're asking is, what's the user experience in terms of administration of all of this, right? And to me, the model has always been that, or at least I think you have this MUD manager versus the enforcement point. And the CPE is the enforcement point. The question is then, what is the MUD manager? Is it really the enforcement point? Is it really the CPE? Or is it the service provider, right? And the service provider knows a little bit about that device and says, oh, I know what works for that device and I know what doesn't work for that device because we see it on, say, 30,000 home networks. And so we have a little bit of experience with it. Or is it Google, for instance, with like a little Google firewall or something like that, where they provide that home access control function? Or is it some other third party who is essentially making a firewall, like it could be Ubiquity, you could imagine, right? Who essentially offer a managed service that doesn't nag the user just because the device is connected, right? Unless the user wants to be nagged. And maybe will only nag the user when it sees a device that it's never heard of, or it sees a device that, let's say, it stepped out of its profile in some way, or there's been some change in behavior. And then maybe it might look and decide. So I think you need to look at MUD as a means to say, here's how the device is expected to behave. And if the device is not behaving as is expected, then somebody has to be told. Now that somebody could be somebody at a service provider saying, hey, maybe you want to take a look at this. And maybe if it's one device out of 30,000, you don't care, right? But if all of a sudden you see 100 devices stepping out of profile, one of two things is possible. One, the device has been upgraded in some way by the manufacturer and they didn't update their MUD file. Or two, the device has been hacked. Either is possible. Either way, the amount of interaction you want to have with the user is dramatically less than what you might say you want in the enterprise. And so one of the things we need a little bit of experience on in this regard, Jordan, is we'd like to get a feel for, from a manufacturer standpoint, right, how often they're going to make those changes, and also whether the abstractions are appropriate. And how do you determine what my controller is in a home, right? Is that the right abstraction for a home device? And how do you do the registration for the controller? It could be that you do some sort of loose form of access control where you start out by not providing access control, and you do a leap of faith to determine who you think the controller is if you see, say, the right port information and the device seems to be behaving as others would. Another 2 points I would make, Jordan, is remember that MUD is meant to be a layered service, so it's not supposed to just be there on its own as the only protection. First of all, the device manufacturer has to do its thing. And the MUD can only provide an additional layer. The second point I wanted to make was that I've been paying attention to the other abstraction, which is domain names, and so I've written some code actually, which gloms onto the DNS cap code that OARC releases. And this thing actually tracks changes the mapping between domain names and IP addresses based on the queries of clients so that you can update the appropriate access control mechanism in OpenWRS. And I've been talking with Michael Richardson about this very point, and I've even gotten permission to release that code from Cisco. I need to do a little bit more work because the output right now looks like IP tables commands, and I think what Michael would like is something more JSON-y. And that's fine. It's a pretty small change, and I'll go ahead and do some JSON-y-like changes, and then you guys can decide whether you find that useful code or not. So I'm sorry that was a long-winded answer to perhaps not even the question you were asking. I don't know.
No. I mean, I think that's I appreciate your answer. I think okay. So one of the things that I'm personally struggling with is, we're trying to build out something that implements access controls. Mm-hmm. If you're saying that, MUD is maybe it's a starting point for policy, maybe it's a policy signaling mechanism. I guess my question is basically, if I'm building this out, I need a whole bunch of other pieces. So, if you're saying, okay, I'm going to do things based on observation, so maybe I'm sending net flow traces up from the home somewhere else. I guess basically is within the wider context of sort of security tools that are out there, what do you see being part of a complete breakfast together with MUD? And do you see adoption happening more as an intermediate representation of policy, or do you see it more as a starting point for manufacturers, or what?
Well, so a little bit of both, and I don't want to, diss MUD entirely, considering I was one of the people who created it. But the key thing is that I think there are a lot of manufacturers out there who need very simple abstractions for the home, right? Like Ring doorbell's a perfect example. Okay, all it needs is domain name, right? It doesn't really need to talk to anything in the house, after it's really gotten going, right? And so it can put out a very simple MUD file that says, just let me talk to my cloud attach point, right? And off I go. Amazon, the Amazon service is exactly the same way. It just wants to talk to its cloud attach point. It doesn't want to be bothered by anything in the home. Those are very simple MUD files. You don't have to do a lot with them. The only thing I would do is maybe check, as these guys are plugged in, I might check the reputation of the domain name of the MUD URL to make sure it looks sane, right? You don't have to start big, but over time, and then you can add more richness over time. So I view it as incremental, right? And then, right, once you get into the incremental, right, you can go from the full breakfast to, the buffet at the Victoria Hotel or something like that, right? Where, you're talking about, let's do that soft start I was talking about. That was a little bit of vision sneaking into this conversation. That's not something we've, really thought about doing just yet, right? One thing we have talked about doing, Jordan, is extending MUD to cover bandwidth profiles. So even if you don't do enforcement, and even if you do enforcement at the access control list, right, models, if a device says that it's supposed to talk to a particular set of devices, if the bandwidth that it's using far and away exceeds what it's designed to do, then maybe you want to report that out. Let me give you an example. there's an occupancy sensor, right? And the occupancy sensor is it does image processing, and it only reports out, a very small amount of data in terms of bandwidth, maybe a couple of bytes a minute. And all of a sudden, you start seeing 600 60 megabytes a second or 6 megabytes a second because the device is a Linux box attached to a camera, right? And something's gone wrong. So we're looking at doing sort of bandwidth profiles as well. But to start with, I would do the very simple, start with a domain name, right? Tackle north-south, maybe implement same manufacturer. And then for my controller, I think that requires a little bit of thought in terms of how you're going to figure out which that device is. And you may simply, and we have some ideas in terms of how we want to automate that too, by the way. Which is if a device can declare itself a controller to the MUD manager for particular classes, isn't that nice? Then you can just fill in all the dots using MUD entirely. I don't know if that helps.
This is Michael. So one of the things that I think we've been struggling to figure out, it's a gap there, is what to do when we quarantine a device because it has, in fact, wandered outside of its profile. One of the things that we've realized is that somehow we need to be able to provide access from the device, from the quarantine network, to the firmware update server, such that the device, assuming it is somehow somehow get an update that might fix it. And so that becomes how do we identify that rule clearly?
Oh, that's a good one. I hadn't thought about that.
And the next side of it is, so the MUD file may or may not refer to a specific version of the firmware, and that's open to the manufacturer. Then we get into this question of, has the device really started running the new firmware that's supposed to be fixed, or is it just pretending to? So there's a remote attestation issue there. But even if, even if we trust the device somehow, we're willing to do that, it's clear that we don't have a industry-wide way of asking what the device firmware version is, although I think that stuff like that sometimes shows up in LLDP. So then it becomes sort of an interaction of how do we get that information in a standard way, or know how to get it, such that we can tell whether the device is running a new enough version of the firmware, such that the MUD file that it actually applies to it.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So I hope it doesn't surprise you that I have no means in MUD, and I don't know of any means to extend MUD to handle remote attestation. It's just it's beyond the scope of the work. But that's not even the point. Clearly, that's out of scope. But the point is that we can write MUD files, and there's a couple different ways of doing them. One of which I think is that the manufacturer provides a new MUD file for each version of the firmware, and the firmware knows what its version is, and points us at the correct MUD file. And so that's pretty good. But then if the manufacturer says on this MUD file, says, oh, this device, the firmware combination is no longer considered safe, and that's a really important thing to think. So we find, oh, okay, we better quarantine it. Even though we don't know that it's done something wrong, we know that it's better be upgraded or else. Then the question is, okay, how do we know when it's really gone through that process? And it gives us a new MUD file. Okay, that's interesting. That works really well. But if we have a manufacturer who just writes the MUD file for all devices, and then we somehow have a version that has to be removed, we have an issue. And then the other thing that I think that I'm not sure if you alluded to or Jordan did, but we think that there is a value in a kind of community-written MUD file, where for devices whose manufacturers are not kind of interested or motivated to be involved, that the community can say, well, this is what we observe and looks like good behavior.
and we're going to contribute this to some kind of a curated mud file repository. And this is what it looks like it's supposed to do. And if it does something else beyond that, it's probably suspicious, or maybe it's not it's just functionality that no one knew it had, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, all good points, Michael. Yeah, this is great because anytime Michael and I get on the phone, I prove myself correct that I'm going to have to answer I don't know a bunch of times. So a couple of thoughts though. Sorry, you wanted to say?
Well, I was going to say that I think that's part of the communal process is, I think, part of the place where it grows beyond manufacturers to be, now, we have, as Jacques explained, serious interest is in preventing the next distributed denial of service attack, because the problem to Sierra and to pretty much all the other. But now it becomes, okay, so we need to somehow get those curated mud files curated, right? We can't just let anything in. That's clearly wrong. And so then we have it becomes more of a social organization problem of what happens next. We have all the technology to do the implementation, but we got to get the next step of what happens to the other part, because it's what's the right word? Tragedy of the commons problem, right? No one owns this problem. Right.
So, I mean, there are a couple of. I only have some thoughts on this, right? I mean, it sounds like we have to think a lot more about it. But let me give you a couple of thoughts. Let's start with one of the first things you said, which was what happens when you need to quarantine device? What access do you limit that device to? The rules today do not say this rule should be used for quarantine. But you know what? That sort of extension, we could do that extension. We could do it in two different ways. Way number one is we add an additional set of access lists which are specifically for quarantine. Way number two is we tag access control entries within existing access lists that are to be retained only that are to be retained when a device is quarantined. I could write it either way. I hadn't thought about it until you raised it on this call. So, but that immediately comes to mind as an interesting approach. Now, the second point is how do I how do I know whether whether the device should the device use a different MUD file when it upgrades its version? Should it use a different MUD URL? You can only do so when we're talking LLDP or DHCP. It's not going to be able to do so when it's not outputting anything in the first place, right? Because it's some sort of legacy device and you developed a MUD QR code or something like that. And B, if it's using a certificate, it can't. If it's a manufacturer-generated certificate, then the MUD, then the field in the certificate can't change. So that's just some thought as we think about what it means to do. When we think about the remote attestation problem. Now there is some work going on both inside and outside the IETF on this. There are these things called canary hashes, which are based on TEAs that my colleague Eric Voigt has been working on to try and provide some sort of secure device attestation. But I don't know if that's the right approach, but I'm certainly thinking about it in those terms. And so then the other point you raised is...
Where is that work happening?
Cisco's done some, and there's a gentleman in Germany that has been working on it. He shows up at the IETF and the IRTF on IoT, and he's on the IoT directorate, but his name is escaping me at this very moment. But if you drop me an email, I'll dig it up.
Okay.
The last point you made was, should we create one big, something like a big GitHub repository? to store mud files. Nothing on this earth says you have to use the resolution mechanism that's in the RFC. You could go to the GitHub repository first or last, right, to see if there's a particular device with a particular mud URL listed. So now the question is, how do you organize that for success? I don't know. I think it's a good question. I know that at least one company has raised that with me already, and a long time ago. And their response at the moment is that they'll keep it internal to themselves for the moment. But I see nothing wrong with doing a GitHub repository. And in fact, there was work done by the University of New South Wales that created a mud file generator. It's not perfect by any stretch.
Yeah, we saw it.
Right. It needs a little bit of work. In fact, it would be great if somebody took it and worked on it a little bit to try and agglomerate it into appropriate abstractions and to get rid of as many IP addresses as you can. I think that would be a very useful thing, and you can use the controller or manufacturer abstractions for that purpose. But you're right; it has to be curated. This thing, and who's going to do that? It's a good question. It's worth exploring. I don't have an answer though.
So I think that our plan is that our software is going to query our database first, and it will provide the MUD URL that we have discovered there, and that it will come back into our database or, as it were, curation, and provide it to the end device, such that we can either amend, extend, or what's the opposite of amend, I guess, if we were to remove contents of it, right? So we may find that the manufacturer suggests some, access that turns out to be not a good thing, right? And so we would want to, in fact, remove that rule from the list. So that requires us to do both adding and subtracting. Obviously breaking the signature, so we wind up having to sign it with our own key, and we have a trust issue with, we have a difference of trust for the different things. And so I would say that work is not, I don't think we're anywhere at all for that point, right? But that's on our project plan to do this, and because it seems clear that we know that we're going to have a lot of devices for which we have the only MUD file, no one else has one, and so we have to talk to ourselves anyway.
I think this is great. By the way, are you guys aware of the NIST project that's going on this?
I don't think so.
Yeah, so there's a NIST project that's going on at the same time for MUD, and it might be fun for you guys to combine forces. I don't know if that's possible, but it would be worth talking to them. And if you send me an email, Jacques, I can point you at the people at NIST.
Yeah? Or share it in the chat, or no, send me an email, whatever.
Yeah, and yeah,
IoT-based automatic distributed threats.
Yep, that's the link in there is good. Yeah, I generally like the idea about the trust, about re-signing, right? One of the things we have to look at carefully, and it was sort of thrown in as part of the IESG last call process, was that there was a signature. There was an additional field that one can list in the manufacturer cert that ties to a very specific MUD file. I think the time will tell whether that was a useful feature, because it might break exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about, where you want to go look at alternative databases. But I think what will end up happening is people are going to ignore that, just for the reasons that you were saying.
So I'll have a look into the NIST stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, I see in the future for MUD or for somewhere else, the need to have more information about device functionality. So the goal of the project is to build a super simple user interface to allow the user to provision its home network. And basically the instructions are, the goal is you can swipe up, down, left, and right on the interface. And to be able to do this, you need to better understand the device profile. And that's where I thought the MUD could potentially help, in that if you look at the picture here, there's a video, alerts, status, and various categories for IoT device. And what I was thinking is that a MUD file could have information on where to go on the device, what's the API, what's the URL on the IoT device to get the status. Where's the video camera can be accessed to, storage, alerts. If you want to know your toaster is burning your toast, go to my toaster/alerts, and then you'll get things. And then if the MUD profile defines these kind of things, then it makes the IoT home network provisioning a lot easier.
I
So
don't
what
see
he
reason
is
not
that
to
that
along these ways.
that the MUD definition includes a little bit about where the device is and how it's accessed. You know, almost like an entry point into what's it called, a semantic web kind of a thing, such that we could actually find out the health of the device as well as whether it's behaving well or not.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things about that. I am, I actually am, I'm a firm believer in Occam's razor, and I'm a firm believer in starting small. And I thought I was with MUD, by the way. I've been proven a little bit wrong in that regard. It seems like it's not as small as I thought it was. But along these lines, my first attempt at all of this was to configure the network based on some small set of attributes about the device. The ones that you have listed here on slide 33 are perfectly, except for one of them, I think, and maybe two of them. I'm not sure. I think that many of them could be done as an extension. Let me go through them just to give you a feel, but you probably already know all of this, so stop me if you do. The information.
These are just examples.
Right. The key distinction I want to make is static information about the device versus dynamic. So things that are static are very well suited for MUD. Things that are dynamic are absolutely not well suited for MUD, because the scale point is the type of device. So if you can't put device specific information into the MUD URL, though you can say this type of device has an interface with which to get that dynamic information. So for instance, here's how you get alerts from this device, right, as an example. And that gets to Michael's point that you begin to encroach upon the semantic web. And the other thing I wanted to say about MUD was the intent was to do as much as possible. Well, let me put it another way. The intent was to do as little as possible on the device, right? To not open new interfaces on the device, because every new interface is an attack surface. And so my goal was to say you don't have to implement anything to implement MUD. You just use whatever you're using today to get an IP address or to report out LLDP, whichever you want to do, that's easiest. So I don't. I want to encourage you not to also create new interfaces on these devices, especially if they, for instance, they don't need an incoming interface. Don't encourage them to have one because they'll get it wrong.
Okay. What do you want to talk about?
We have 10 more
Implementation?
minutes.
Well, I mean, we kind of talked the circles around this a little bit. This is Fowd, by the way. So what were your thoughts about the scenario where the vendor does not have a MUD file? And so in order to kind of facilitate in an enterprise environment where you have this device that someone's trying to connect or they're using it for pilot or whatever, but you still need to create that profile to allow it access to the network. What were your thoughts to how you would deal with those kind of situations? So I'll give you the specific scenario where a lot of consumers, even organizations, are looking to bring in a lot of lower cost Asian sensors and actuators and stuff like that into the market and connect them. And I mean, in some cases they already are for agriculture and other projects. So how would you deal with those kind of situations?
Well, yeah, this is where I sort of left the consumer market and said to myself, let's start with gaining traction in enterprise class gear, because you do end up in a race to the bottom in the consumer market pretty quickly. The Mariah attack was a perfect example of white box, white labeled boxes going awry. But let me turn it around and ask, well, what's yours?
So in our case, like what our model, like how we thought we would solve this problem is, that's why we created like the 2-tier. So if we have someone buys a camera, for example, attempt to plug it into the network, we have no idea what it is, but if there's aspects that come off of the device that would basically say, based on the MAC address or whatever, this is potentially this is possibly a camera from this component, the component manufacturer, et cetera, et cetera. So
Right.
Given that it looks like a camera, feels like a camera, chances are it's a camera, then let's send it a potential camera profile. But in that situation, we're not going to allow it any external access. We will only allow it local, like LAN kind of access. So it can basically operate, the user can interoperate with it, that kind of stuff, but no, it cannot go to like network or like internet kind of access. So that would be one. And then two, like if we see anything suspicious, it's automatically kind of quarantined.
Yeah, interesting. So if you can get away with that, I think that's great. But what I would say is go cautiously on this. And the reason is that if you implement a mechanism for users that ultimately frustrates the proper functioning of the device, regardless, they're not going to blame, they may not blame the maker of the device. They'll probably, if they know that this mechanism is in place on their CPE, they'll probably rip it out. And so you want to be a little bit careful about, you don't want you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good, and it might take a while for some of these, Chinese manufacturers to come around. And so that's one caution that I would say. But up till in a way, right? Many of these devices, especially the cameras, they want to uplink to one particular cloud service. And if you can capture that through the profiling mechanism, this really is beyond MUD, right? It's just how you do profile in the absence of any sort of declarative model like MUD. You want to try and at least find the endpoint that it needs to talk to. and maybe do a
Yeah.
validation on the reputation of the IP address.
Yeah, so we thought about that as well. So that's why one of the slides that Jacques had was that our repository also has an associated service. So when we have that new device being recognized on the network, it sends like a dump to the service, which is Sierra. We do the analysis of it to actually determine, okay, this is the first time we've seen this touch any of the routers anywhere. And so we would have to do some analysis of it to say, okay, here's the additional pieces we would have to have. What I gave you was the scenario was, that's the first time we've ever seen it. It's going to put it almost in an untrusted mode.
Oh,
Until we can actually, right, here's the actual cloud service, and it might be in Beijing or it might be in Singapore or wherever, but here's where it needs to talk to, all those kind of things. So on the initial deployment of it, yes, it might not work functioning, might not work correctly, but then subsequent to that, we should be able to get the device working the way it should, to at least make sure it's, you know, the customer's getting what they are promised out of the product. But at the same time, if all of a sudden it's attempting to go to another site that could be in, Japan, for example, and we know for a fact that the hosting is not in Japan, then we can basically block that access and potentially, again, quarantine it till we understand exactly what's going on with the device.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like your approach. I didn't quite understand it initially. Now that I hear what you're saying, I think it sounds about right. I noticed on this slide, by the way, that you have the "it would be nice if the device could advertise its current firmware version, either via Wi-Fi connection, DPP, DHCP, or LLDP." I want to say one of the other problems I'm looking at is wireless onboarding on the whole. I think we're not as far along, and actually Michael and I were having a conversation about that earlier in the day, to see what we can do to improve wireless onboarding as the bigger picture. That's an aside from this discussion. I would also say there's a couple of other things to mention. There is now, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's osmud.org. And there's another.
Look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. And these guys are they're actually starting a small company to do this. But I think there's probably some room for collaboration with them, and in terms of the work that they're doing. And I think they are motivated, by the way, to do some curating. Right now, whether they'll release their curation, I don't know, and that's a worthy conversation. Because I'll tell you the other thing that tends to happen, right? You have these companies like Fingerpoint, right, or other database companies of that have various profiles, and they view those databases as highly proprietary because that's what they're selling.
So we're running out of time here. Maybe if I can jump in, Eliot, do you have any last 2-minute thoughts about what we're doing?
Well, first, I want to thank everybody for having me. I did more talking than I thought I would do, actually. And for that, I apologize. I would have rather listened a little bit more, because I think what you guys are doing is really interesting. I think there's some opportunities for MUD extensions based on what you've discussed and mentioned. And I'd like to think about the problem of the curation problem a little bit. And I'd like to work with you guys on that and on your deployment as you go forward. So if it's possible, I'd love to stay tuned into your work. And if there's any way I can help, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I think I recently included you on my mailing list, so I'll make sure that you get all the information. And our next meeting is on November 20th, so it'll be in Ottawa. I'm not sure if you can make it to that or not, but we'll certainly.
When is it?
It'll be in Ottawa.
When?
On November 20th.
Remote?
Yep, that's possible. So.
Very possible then.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for.
Sure. We also talk every week at this time, Eliot. So it's not a formal anything, but Jacques hosts us at Sierra. So you could phone into that anytime you want to talk this time slot.
Oh,
You know,
thanks.
usually we're together.
Thanks for the offer. If I could, if somebody would just forward me the invitation with that, is it the same invitation?
No, it's a different.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, if you'll forward me the invitation, I'll be happy. I won't be able to make it every week, but I would love to chime in when I can.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your input.
Thank you. I mean, I think what you're doing is great. It's, you know, it looks like you have a pretty good idea as to where you want to go, and you have a pretty good idea what the problems are. And by the way, I will end with one more thought. There's clearly work for research here, and we are funding some of that. And Cisco can fund more. You just need to, if you know researchers who are interested, just point them at me.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks
Thank
everyone
you
for
very
joining
much.
us today.
Thanks. Bye-bye.